Okay, and we are live. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our viewers all over the world. I'm so glad you could tune in to this third edition of our Friday Fireside chat. So, welcome here. And I'd like to welcome our guest, James Berthoty, to the live session. I was really looking forward to this, so I'm so glad to have you here.
Thanks. Yeah, it's great to
My
be
name
here.
is my name is Anish Bhargav from AppSec Engineer, and I'm joined by Cloud Security Engineer Ganga Sumant. So
Hey,
we are really excited to get this live session started. So before we start, I'd just like to remind our viewers that there is a link in the description for a giveaway of the DevSecOps bundle on AppSec Engineer, which contains the DevSecOps and container security courses. So you should really go click that link and share your information with us on the Google form so that we can contact you and we will select a lucky winner this week. Because last year's lucky winner of the AWS giveaway was Vaishnav. So congratulations, Vaishnav, and I hope you learn some really cool new things with the AWS security bundle, and you have 1 full year of access to that bundle if you're a winner of the giveaway. So I hope you really enjoy that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest, James Berthoty. James has been in technology for over 10 years with focuses in IT leadership, engineering, and security. An early advocate for DevSecOps, he has a passion for driving security teams as contributors to product. He has worked in various cloud security and security architecture roles over the years, and he's currently serving as a senior security engineer at PagerDuty. He lives in North Carolina with his wife and 3 children and is pursuing a PhD in philosophy. So
Yes,
thanks so
thank
much
you.
for joining us, James.
No, it's great to be here. I
Yeah.
think everything you guys are working on is so critical for both up leveling security
Mhm.
teams while also teaching security to developers. I mean, it's really a two-way street, so it's all great.
Yeah, absolutely. You kind of need to get a middle ground between security and developers. And training is honestly the way to go for that.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I think
yeah.
it's the critical issue, honestly, in terms of
Hmm.
most because I've worked for different service providers, and most security teams are just so used to like this box of the SIM and incident response and how do I deal with
Right.
alerts, and
Hmm.
that model is just totally not built for like modern cloud challenges, and so it's just a huge skill transition and a huge opportunity for people who learn the skill as well.
Yeah, that's great, because like that's what we really like to focus on, the hands-on aspect of it, where we basically build out a proper simulation of the thing, and you're not just,
Yeah.
ticking boxes. You're actually getting involved in the nitty-gritty of the cloud security and all of that. So
Yeah, and I mean,
yeah.
that's why the certified Kubernetes administrator test is so
Mhm.
hard, is because it's so hands-on, just like all the good cert
Right.
tests are. And the only way to learn it is through like places like you that have good
Yeah.
simulated environments to actually like get going on stuff to try to learn things. So
Yeah. That's great. So my first question to you, James, would be, you spoke about this in a recent LinkedIn post where you said security has to really focus on empowering developers instead of roadblocking them. As a security engineer, how exactly would you go about this? And what are some steps every security team needs to take in order to collaborate better with the developers?
yeah, I think to the first part of the question, really in terms of that traditional security model of the SIM and incident response type stuff, that was
Mhm.
like one side of security. And then you have application security as sort of a different problem that has existed in its traditional form, where application security used to be something that only like really huge organizations could deal with. Like I remember one of the first people I met was with Nike, and you think
Mhm.
about the challenges with retail and application security is like they can afford to hire someone to focus on that because they have real monetary loss on the line if someone is exploiting their buying platform. But most
Okay.
companies just don't have that sort of like direct fraud type issue that could happen in their platform unless they were of
Mhm.
huge scale. But I was also really stricken by someone who told me once we were talking through DAST solutions, dynamic application scanning, And they pointed out my title being cloud security engineer, yet I was the
Mm-hmm.
lead on the DAST product. And that's a sign of like how much things have shifted, where application security today is really a combination of the SIM type skills, the alerting, the vulnerability analysis with the application security side, but it all happens so much faster now, where just a lot of teams are stuck in these old models that aren't accounting for how developers work, and it's creating just constant friction across all sides of the enterprise, where CISOs aren't getting the metrics they need, they're not getting the visibility they need, they're not getting the risk profiles that they need to bubble up to the board. So they're feeling the hurt from that side. And meanwhile, development just hates working with security because every 90 days they have a random security review that's looking at like the last 3 months of code changes they've made, and they've made thousands of commits and trying to like chase down individual pull requests to look for things, to flag things that are particularly vulnerable is just impossible.
Right.
And so I think that's the way most teams have looked at things, is as a roadblock in that sense,
Mm-hmm.
where working with security is just constantly frustrating. And I think the solution to it is really, first of all, I don't think you can really tackle this problem until like the training you're working on and doing, until you've made a commit to the repository. Like at the last like few jobs I've had, I've known I'm not going to have developer respect until I've committed something to production. And that's not just for the relationship side, although it is that as well. It's also just understanding the technologies that are happening and really being able to empathize with the pain points, the release structure, looking for security vulnerabilities along the way. So I think just being willing to get hands-on and actually just push a change through,
Mm-hmm.
or sit with your DevOps team and try to learn like, how are we maintaining the health of these services? How are we monitoring this stuff? Is really the first important step. And I think that transitions into that second question, right? Of what steps do you take to collaborate with the developers? It's like getting hands-on with stuff, especially like in a remote first world, is really going to be the only way you can do it, because especially with most people being remote. But even without that, right? I'm thinking back to office jobs I've had where if the dev team was on a different floor, they might as well have been in another state. Like it didn't matter that
Yeah.
that we worked in the same building. You have to create opportunities to talk to each other. And you're only going to get that by paying attention, by trying to be actively engaged and asking questions. And asking questions not from the typical security stance, which is like sort of interrogative, where you're like, they feel like they're getting interrogated or policed by you, but asking questions because you're genuinely curious about how something is getting done, so that then once you've understood enough after a few months of time, maybe at that point you're willing to contribute to or able to contribute meaningfully to a security discussion that's happening there.
Right. I've heard this from a couple of industry experts as well, that, security engineers need to know code in order to really be able to empathize with the developers and kind of, speak their language.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, it was intimidating for me because I came up the help desk way, the way a lot of I typically separate security into 3 buckets of how people get into it. The ones like me where it's like help desk into sysadmin into like Linux admin into like DevOps happens, and then sort of you're in security all of a sudden. The other bucket is like from the security operations standpoint, where you're a SOC analyst, engineer, you're dealing with SIMs all day, and that's how you're in the security. And then the third is the developer, and that's what everyone's. I mean, if you come in that background, it's very automatically like lucrative, and there's a ton of options because it's worth a lot. But it has its own set of challenges as well. And so for people that don't know how to code, the cloud has really enabled a lot of, even if you don't know how to code, there's a lot of like pseudo code that in one sense makes you kind of dangerous because you can come across as knowing more than you do, like I probably do.
Okay.
But in the other way, it's also super beneficial because there are so many DevOps people I know who like could put Python and Go on a resume, but like they only know how to use those languages in the context of like, here's this script I downloaded from GitHub. It's really more about knowing developer workflows, knowing how systems work, being able to engage with like VS Code, CI/CD pipelines, GitHub, GitLab. It's more about knowing that tool set and ecosystem than it is about like, I'm going to take a year and learn how object-oriented programming works. Like that's going to be a total waste of time compared to the other sorts of engagements you can do.
Nice. Actually, a follow-up question to the same thing. You were talking about how developers seem to run on sprints and they have shorter time frames, while security teams usually lag quite far behind. Is there any other way you think you could marry those two, maybe shorten those time frames perhaps and make them?
Yeah, this is definitely a huge struggle. And I mean, this is sort of more a tangent in terms of I've also seen this happening more and more on like the systems engineering side, where they're trying to build systems for developers that work on sprints, but they also have operational tickets coming up that they have to respond to. And the way that I've really had this work well is by separating in my mind security tooling in general, but also roles and responsibilities into configuration scanning on the one side and then runtime scanning on the other side. And the reason that helps is that it sets expectations around all of my in pipeline scanning. Like you could nerd out and spend an unlimited amount of time there setting up open source tools, paid tools, different visibility stuff, automated remediations for certain instances. But really, security is not the end user of those tools. It's developers and DevOps teams who are going to be the ones to fix things, and fixing the vulnerabilities is harder than just finding them. And so for as far as marrying it into the sprint cycle, I think the tooling and approach that you take to vulnerabilities and configuration scanning is how you do that, where you're not thinking, how am I going to scan all of my prod servers and then get those tickets over to dev to fit in their pipeline? It's how can I natively get those alerts in their pipeline directly to them in a system they're going to actually use. And then on the runtime side, like I think that is for security. That's where security teams do want to get the alerts, and developers don't care if there's an alert for some new public unencrypted bucket, and then security, like the old way is security gets that alert, then has to like spend all day hunting down who owns the bucket, why was it made, is it a false positive, is it going away? That's why that configuration scanning should be not thought of as runtime, but runtime is for actual, like we saw a remote shell to this pod, we saw a reverse shell attempted to get loaded, things that are actually showing attempts to exploit the system is where I think security should be focused as, and more the maintainers of the configuration scanning side of the house.
Nice. Just moving on to the second question. Do you want to take this, Anish?
Yeah, sure. So, it's well known that DevSecOps is anything but straightforward to implement. So in your experience, what are some of the biggest mistakes product teams make when trying to build DevSecOps pipelines and shift security left?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk all day about the lessons learned here from my side, where it is definitely easier to fail than it is to get right. I had a talk with Scott from Stackhawk, and I think his 3-pillared approach is really good in terms of people, process, and technology, where you really need all 3 of those things to be well aligned to really achieve shifting left or DevSecOps. Because I've been at places where I've chosen the wrong technology and seen just the absolute pain that's caused, whether it's like giving developers really long IDE installation instructions that are really unintuitive, using runtime vulnerabilities and trying to ticket them out after the fact. That's why I always recommend, before anyone purchases a vulnerability tool, to fix a vulnerability using the tool as part of your assessment. Because security usually gets really hung up on like, what's the best scanner and what has the most data and how are we going to know the most. But again, the hardest part is fixing, and that's the part that that's what you're actually asking people to do. And so if you're evaluating that in technology, I think you'll make some better technology choices. But really, I've gotten that wrong and then corrected it. But the people problem really requires a really acute knowledge from especially executive leadership about what their security program is trying to accomplish. Because I really am like a product-led org kind of person. And I think that comes down to product owners owning the risk for their product, where not every product needs to have the same level of security built around it. And what DevSecOps even means for different organizations of different maturities and different sizes is really going to vary a lot. Like for some orgs, AWS GuardDuty plus the free version of Sneak plus the open source secret scanner is going to be like perfectly fine security for what they're trying to do. But for other orgs, that would be a giant risk and a huge issue that they're only using that to try to combat it. And so once you have that clear goal of here's why security contributes to product, and we are working with you to decide the right level of security for what we're building, then you need to have relationships built both from engineers to engineers, but also between executives, because at the end of the day, shift left DevSecOps is ultimately going to create more work for developers. There's really no way around it. Because something that they used to be able to ignore for months at a time while security review and like did all their stuff and then next quarter, whatever, like now it's interrupting their workflow. And so you have to have buy-in from their management, from their leadership that like, hey, we didn't get to this sprint item. And that's okay because we know that this security thing ended up coming up and causing an issue. And once that relationship is built and trust between the departments, that's where you can really build clear processes that are going to help keep things moving between the teams. And so really, I think it's really that combination of tools. And if any one of them goes wrong, it just creates so many problems.
Yeah. Do you think does the DevSecOps and the automation process and the tooling, does that initially create some friction between the developers and the security engineers? How does that play out usually?
Yeah, it definitely does at first. Like you're gonna have to be willing to like look stupid. Because I can think of things I did. I was trying to reflect on why for the first time I rolled something out, it went terribly and the devs like really hated me for it. And then the next time, like everything was totally fine and it was great. And a lot of that was, you learn a lot when you're putting something new in pipeline is a non-trivial interruption to what people are doing. And so you have to be really cognizant of that and really patient and really over communicate in order to get through. And I mean, the biggest thing is security teams are always super hot to get to blocking builds and like, how are we going to make it so the build fails if there's a new high? And then how can only we be the approvers of it? And I think it's important to be really, really gentle with how you roll that out. First of all, because it's sort of fundamentally, I think a lot of that stuff sells a lot better than it actually helps in the first place, because it sort of fundamentally misunderstands like how vulnerabilities happen. Like no developer is intentionally going to a 10-year-old library to import it into their project, right? Like instead, it's not that they were introducing a new vulnerability, it's that the package became vulnerable and they never updated it. So that's the first thing, is realizing like blocking builds is not, I've heard it called stop the bleeding before, and I don't think that's really accurate, because it's sort of like unrelated. It's like you're bleeding out your arm and someone puts a Band-Aid on your forehead or something. It's like it's totally unrelated from where the increase is coming from. And with that in mind, I think you'll be more okay with the idea that you can allow vulnerabilities through, giving devs some ownership in that process. So it's not just security that has the ability to approve letting vulns through, but it's people on their own team, service owners, and building that trust.
Right. So there's like, a bit of a learning curve. So.
Yeah. I mean, yes, as you learn anything in pipeline, you're going to need to keep in mind the context of everyone's service. And that's what makes it hard, is you're not going to know that the first time that like you broke some principal developer has some Rust pet project that he hasn't touched in 2 years that's keeping everything working and now it fails or whatever. Like you're not going to know that going into it.
Right.
Yeah.
Nice.
Context.
Yeah.
I'll take the next question. With how much talk there is of AI and large language models floating around, I have to ask, does generative AI factor in any tangible way in your workflow today? And
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and do you see it playing a bigger role in the years to come?
I saw a great graph today that was like things CEOs talked about this year, and generative AI was like off the chart compared to everything else.
Yeah, it is like a big talking point. So I just, had to ask. I was really curious.
No, yeah, and it's a great, I mean, to be honest, I experimented with trying to have it build like CVE adjustments automatically. But so if we talk about like generative AI in terms of like non-product versions of it, like just using chat type stuff, I think it's almost extremely not useful. Because it so much lacks like the specialized, I mean, especially ChatGPT with like I know you can scan internet stuff now if you like direct it to, but I mean, the cloud computing and security practices have already changed significantly since 2021. And so it's just not up to date enough to like provide actually useful guidance.
Right. Yeah.
It does a fine job summarizing stuff, whatever. But like I didn't have use when I tried to have it like adjust scores based on mitigating factors and stuff like that. Like it's way too specialized for it. Where I do think there's a lot of opportunity is what Sneak is working on with like, I mean, they're branding it the deep code stuff now. With this idea of, I'm sure where they're going with it is automated code patching, right? Where it's like your SaaS detects an issue and now here's, just like they do for SCA, where your suggested PR is bumped from 4.1 to 4.2, but now it's like add in, here we'll parameterize the SQL query for you. And I think it has a lot of use there, as well as in like the learning capacity, where the hardest part of all of this stuff, when you get an alert that's like cross-site scripting, is validating, like, is there cross-site scripting? And then even knowing like how to validate that. And that is like super hard to validate. Like it's time consuming. If you're going to try to create a POC to validate that, that's super time consuming. And so that's where I think there is some use for generative AI is actually in the coding stuff.
Right.
As well as, I mean, there's plenty of opportunities in, if you want to contribute to like the OWASP top 10 for LLM. There's a fun game, I forget who put it out, of where like the wizard knows a passcode using generative AI and you have to try to get it to reveal the passcode. There's a lot of
the game, the LLM, right?
Yeah. It's a super cool thing. And I think that's the opportunity is really like, how do we securely use these things and what are the risks? And then the regular code applications. But as far as like, it's really a technology in search of a use case, I think, right now, from like a chat perspective.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, at this point, it seems more like it's just useful for writing surface level blog posts than really doing anything that's
Well, we were joking about LinkedIn before, but I've started doing like if anyone if I see too many emojis in a LinkedIn post, I know at that point that it was ChatGPT. Because if you ask that thing to
Oh
do
yeah, I read your post about that. That was pretty funny.
yeah, literally, if you ask it to write a LinkedIn post, it's just slapping emojis through like number and all the points. It's just dumb. So
Right.
Garbage and garbage
So,
out.
oh yeah, seriously.
yeah.
So my next question would be, there's no single correct way to do DevSecOps, and tooling varies from one organization to the next. But what specific tools and frameworks do you use for security automation and building CI/CD pipelines?
Yeah, I mean, I'm super lucky to have been given a ton of freedom very early on to experiment with a lot of different tooling. And I really value that experience because a lot of times I guess my biggest thought here would be not to feel constricted by these check boxes from a tooling perspective. Because at a high level, like every CNAP, which cloud native application protection platform, is going to check all the boxes, right? They're all going to say they do IAC scanning, vulnerability scanning, runtime protection, CSPM. They're going to say they do all of it, but their approaches are all pretty drastically different and even use some very different underlying technologies to make it happen. And so even if it's like, oh, well, Lacework has the machine learning thing, but Sysdig has the Falco rules, which are more robust. It's like you got to actually get in there and test it if you're going to evaluate like which one's actually better. Because just on a sales call or like in their, I'm sure everyone's still doing Log4j demos is like the thing that is like every demo I get is using that. That's what always is happening. And so I would say not to feel constrained, but as far as my specific tools, man, I went from a GitLab company to a GitHub to a GitLab to a GitHub. And I thought the last time I came back to GitHub that they would have figured out how to make CI/CD pipelines not just insanely complicated, but it's still like a total just nightmare. Like it's a mix of like Circle CI, Build Kite, different like GitHub Actions and cloud runners and hosted runners. Like it is a mess. So for simplicity's sake, GitLab is my preference on like the pipeline side, because at least it's straightforward.
Right.
GitHub it's super easy to like click the box to say like add this to my pipeline, and then it's very hard to like manage it from that point.
Right.
But I mean, they're all the same tools work with both of them, whatever. And so that again comes down to like, don't get so hung up on like, oh, what checkbox. Like they both do basically the same thing. And then from a security side, because I separate things, and for some organizations, it might not make sense to do the configuration versus runtime thing, because they have smaller security teams, smaller developer teams, and they find value in like that all-in-one platform. My favorite for like that general soft, smaller approach is Wiz. I think they have a very elegant like CSPM combined with Terraform scan. Like it's a very infrastructure focused product. But then I think the combination of Sneak, Sysdig, and Stackhawk is really what's compelling for 99% of organizations, because you just have Sneak check all of your boxes. Like there's other providers that do specific things really well and better than them in specific areas. But just the idea that you can have an all-in-one developer platform, like I'm never going to convince devs to like, here, open this SaaS tool and then open this SCA tool and then open this IAC tool. Like just telling them like, here's the security box on your Okta that you have to interact with sometimes is super valuable. And then Stackhawk is really the only one I know who's really tackling running DAST in pipeline. Every other DAST I've used is like a total nightmare. That's like crawling or like run it for 4 hours once a month or something. Like if you're going to try to do it in pipeline, I think they're the only option really. I know I hope I don't get a LinkedIn message from someone after this. They're an amazing tool that does it as well. But Sysdig really is, because of their focus on the details, is why I love Sysdig for security teams on the runtime side. Because I ran a super objective evaluation of a lot of different tools, and they were the only ones who consistently could see activities inside of containers and surface that information in a way that made sense to a junior analyst. Because a lot of these tools will say, like, this Kubernetes node had a reverse shell. Well, no, they didn't even detect that. It's like this Kubernetes node had Nmap fire on it. But if you give that to a junior analyst, it's like they have no logs. They don't know what namespace. They don't know what container. They don't know where it's from, who did it, if it's real or not. Versus from Sysdig, you're actually getting, like, it was at this namespace from this container. The container's up or not, at like still running. It's just so much more value there. That's really my general approach. I also have I have a lot of asterisks for tons of other tools. But I think Datadog is great if you have a strong DevOps team that's primarily leading the show and they're already all in on Datadog. Like, instead of trying to, like, and you're coming in as security, it's like, instead of trying to roll your own stack, just go ahead and hop on the train with them, and the Datadog stuff's fine. Like, you'll be okay.
A lot less friction. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So yeah, okay, sure. We're getting close to running out of time, so I'll just ask another question here. Is it feasible for a product team to rely entirely on open source tools and platforms to build their DevSecOps pipelines, or will they need to go to a vendor at some point? And when should they make that leap from open source to paid?
Yeah, I mean, that is such a good question. I am a huge buy versus build guy in terms of on the buying side, because the tail on do-it-yourself open source stuff is unfathomably long, and it never ends. Like, you roll, because just it feels so good when like Trufflehog is a great open source secret scanner. You get that running in pipeline. It's just a Docker image. You just add it to the end of your Docker file. Boom, great. But then your vuln scanner detects that, oh, there's vulns from the Trufflehog repo on this version, and then, oh, there's a new version out, and we've got to patch it, and oh, we patched it, and I didn't test Trufflehog with C#, and it doesn't support C# secrets, and we got a new like, it just it just opens a box of complexity out of nowhere, that really your whole team is going to be dedicated to just managing that. So I think using open source tools is great for point in time assessments. So if someone says, I need an SCA, like, say I'm a one-man security person at a medium-sized org, and it's like, I need a quick report of, like, how vulnerable we are, of any SAST issues we might have, of, like, using Scout Suite to run a quick, like, cloud compliance check. Like, those are all great uses of open source tooling. But the second you try to, like, automate it, scale it, move it in the pipeline, all of a sudden it's like, we got to hire someone to manage Scout Suite, and we got to hire someone to manage Trufflehog, and we got to hire someone to like, you're spending way more money and time on the personnel than you are on the product. And so I would say, when there's some organizational business reason to commit to security in pipeline, would be when to make the move. When it's no more like, you got your sales guy saying, like, oh, this guy is worried and wants our vuln report, and then, like, you're just hacking something. Like, then you don't need to, like, go out and buy Sneak because, like, one sales guy asked for something. But if it's becoming like, we need a SOC 2 type 2, and it's like, we're worried about our SDLC policy, that it's not going to be looked at well by the auditors, then it's like, all right, well, we should buy something to bolster our SDLC. Instead, don't be the security superhero that's like, we don't need to buy anything. I can just roll these 5 different things. It'll take me 2 weeks, and then I'll quit in 6 months, and then someone else will deal with the nightmare that I've created.
Right. Thanks. I just have one last question for you before we end the session. Do you have 3 to 4 pro tips for product teams that are building out a DevSecOps program? Whether it's to do tooling or deployment or maintenance, and basically things that most people tend to overlook or just don't know about.
Yeah, my number one pro tip that I forgot about until just now because I should go do it as well is getting. There's this DevSecOps maturity model that OWASP puts out. There's also the software assurance maturity model. Yeah, and that's what most people are more familiar with. But the DSOM, which is the DevSecOps one, if you can get your executive team to commit to quarter over quarter raising those scores, that's how you can lock in your security budget and your security program. Because otherwise there's way too many technical details of like, oh, we have SCA but not SAST, or we have DAST but not secret scanning, whatever. It's always going to be hard, but that maturity model covers like every tool you could possibly want to do and like use cases for it. And it provides an objective measurement for hey CISO, hey CTO, whoever's arguing for the money for it. If we want to hold to our commitment, we have to implement an SCA, or we have to implement a DAST. Like that's historically how I got DAST accomplished, was by saying it's an item on the thing we committed to. And so we could not do it, or we could keep checking the box like we have been with this scanner that's like 403ing half the time. But we should, like, if we actually want to do this, like, it's on the checklist. And that way it's not they're arguing with you. At that point, they're arguing with like OWASP. And so it's like, okay.
Right.
So that's probably my biggest tip that I always forget about, because it's what empowers you to actually get stuff done. But then beyond that is the making the first commit to a repo. Like you don't have to, there might be a fear that learning to make a commit to a repo means learning object-oriented programming. But like I've updated like docs, KBs count as updating repos too, right? Like I have a pull request. I can say that I'm a contributor to OWASP because I updated documentation. Like it's not a coding challenge. Like text changes have to happen as well. It's more about learning the process and the workflow. And then I really think it's just about getting involved and not focusing on how do I become like the principal developer who like knows everything about something, but just how can I take the next step to actually contribute something to the product, and as such, learn security in the process.
Like an incremental improvement.
Yeah. And then I guess the final tip would be, because I think you asked specifically about product implementing DevSecOps. And from that perspective, it's really about being realistic with your goals about what you want to do. But then also making sure you're hiring the right skill set. And I see so many, there's two like ditches that I wouldn't go on. The one ditch is like, I'm looking for a guy with a CISP who's like, memorized every textbook about compliance, whatever. And then the other ditch is like, I don't care if you know security at all. I just want like the guy that can slam out Terraform or something. And really, you have to be willing to work with people who, because you're asking for such a broad skill set that people are going to be weak at something. And so it's about creating a shared skill set that's able to accomplish what your objectives are. And so really in the hiring process, focusing on not legacy skills and not pure development stuff, but people who like know what Kubernetes is and containers and are used to like working in that environment, and then getting them up to speed on your particular environment.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That brings us to the end of this session. Thanks so much for joining us, James. And thank you so much to our viewers for joining us for this live session. I'm so glad you tuned in, and I really hope I'm sure you guys would have learned something interesting from this. So before we end this, I just like to remind our viewers that one, we do have a discount, a 25% off discount running on our DevSecOps security bundle on AppSec Engineer. So as I said, that contains the DevSecOps and container security learning paths. So that gives you 1 year of full year of access to all of those courses and all of those labs. So check that out and grab that before it runs out 12 hours from now, actually. So you should hurry on that. And of course, we do have the giveaway running right now. So you can check out the link in the description and share your details with us, and we will email the lucky winner and announce them in the next live session. So get on that right now. All right.
Just before we leave,
Sure,
sorry. You said something about getting your hands dirty and like making that commit, and even if it is simply something as simple as writing documentation, I just want to add that it actually adds quite a bit of value, because usually you see that documentation is something that's like an afterthought, and it means that people who are walking into this are left with less, it's not as accessible. And I just want to say that even doing that is actually a good contribution, and it gets you in through the door and you can do more later on. So that was really cool to hear.
Yeah. I mean, that's even with the DevSecOps maturity model, actually, there was the front page walkthrough had one version on it, and the about section had another version, and I was using the wrong one. And so I did a pull request to like update the version number. And it's like, that's super, like that blocked me for like hours, like trying to figure out what was wrong. And so you are actually helping when you fix stuff like that.
Yep.
Right. Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us, James. This is a really insightful session. So
thank you both too. It was great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks. See ya.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.